Jordan Matthews, a skilled and experienced black criminal defense attorney, had just returned to his hometown after wrapping up a high-profile corruption case in the nation's capital. With a growing reputation, he was someone young lawyers aspired to emulate. However, despite his prestige and exceptional expertise, Jordan never forgot his roots, a small southern town where injustice and prejudice still lingered in everyday life. That morning, the weak sunlight filtered through thin clouds, casting a serene yet heavy atmosphere. Jordan drove to the local courthouse to attend a hearing about his family's land. The property where his grandmother had lived and raised him had been unfairly taxed by the local government. While the case seemed straightforward, Jordan understood that the land's significance went far beyond its monetary value. It was a legacy, a treasury of memories, and the very place where he had learned his earliest lessons about justice from his grandmother, who always reminded him, "Never bow to injustice." As he arrived at the courthouse, Jordan immediately noticed how different it felt compared to the large, modern courtrooms he was accustomed to. The old building showed its age with peeling paint and walls scarred by time. Even the parking lot seemed oppressive, with strangers casting scrutinizing glances his way. Stepping out of his car, Jordan adjusted his deep blue tie and his tailored suit. He knew he wouldn't be warmly welcomed here, but he wasn't one to shy away from the unspoken hostility that often followed him in places like this. At the entrance, things took an unexpected turn. A middle-aged white security guard, with a cold, detached gaze, stopped him and asked suspiciously, "What are you doing here?" Maintaining his composure, Jordan calmly explained that he was attending a court hearing regarding a family matter. Yet, instead of letting him pass, the guard demanded that he step aside for a thorough check. Nearby, curious onlookers quickly turned their attention to Jordan. He couldn't ignore the stark contrast in how the guard treated him compared to the white individuals who walked through without question or delay. Jordan remained composed, but deep inside he felt a familiar sting of injustice. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such a situation, yet each occurrence still brought with it a dull, persistent ache. After several minutes of unnecessary inspection, the guard begrudgingly allowed him to proceed, but couldn't resist muttering a snide remark, loud enough for Jordan to hear, "Don't waste the court's time." Once inside, Jordan immediately sensed the oppressive atmosphere of injustice seeping through every corner of the courthouse. The aged walls were adorned with a few faded legal plaques, yet there was no sense of justice emanating from the space. Most of the people waiting were locals, predominantly black, sitting with anxious expressions and clutching stacks of documents tightly. In contrast, the white defendants appeared at ease, some even chatting casually with courthouse staff. Jordan clenched his jaw slightly but kept his face neutral as he took in the scene. The courthouse wasn't just old. It was a relic of a system where prejudice seemed woven into its very foundation. He knew this wouldn't be an ordinary day, and with every step he took deeper into the courthouse, he felt the weight of history and the ongoing fight for justice pressing down on him. Jordan quickly found the courtroom listed on his summons. On the door, the words "Judge Edward Gaines" were etched in shiny brass, standing out against the dark wooden frame. He paused, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Jordan had heard plenty about Judge Gaines, a man known for his strict courtroom demeanor, but equally infamous for his bias. Stories about Gaines often came paired with tales of injustice endured by the town's residents for years. As Jordan entered the courtroom, a chill seemed to sweep over him, as if the air itself carried the weight of the room's history. The small space was lined with old wooden benches, and the sharp, scrutinizing gaze of Judge Gaines, seated high on the bench, only made the atmosphere more intimidating. Jordan took a seat, his eyes scanning the room. The people there seemed accustomed to the oppressive atmosphere, as though injustice had become an expected part of their lives. When the proceedings began, Jordan quickly realized he wasn't the only one being treated unfairly. An elderly black woman tried to explain her case but was repeatedly interrupted by Judge Gaines, who barely let her finish a sentence. A young black man was fined a significant amount for arriving just a few minutes late, while white individuals who entered after him were not even acknowledged. Jordan felt a surge of anger rising within him, every fiber of his being tightening in frustration. What he saw wasn't just unfair treatment, it was institutionalized injustice. Finally, his name was called. Jordan stood, aware of the many eyes now fixed on him. This wasn't just a case about property taxes, it was the beginning of a confrontation with a system of injustice that Jordan never thought he would have to face again. He walked to the podium, keeping his voice steady and clear, even though he knew the real battle was only beginning. Jordan Matthews felt the tension in the room as Judge Edward Gaines continued to preside with a cold, unyielding demeanor. The judge's piercing eyes scanned the courtroom, lingering longer on the faces of people of color, as though judging them solely for being present. Sitting on the bench, Jordan observed every movement and every word of Judge Gaines with a sharp eye. He had dealt with strict judges throughout his career, but he had never encountered such overt bias. The rumors about Gaines were not baseless. They were unfolding right in front of him. The session continued with one unfair decision after another. A white man entered the courtroom late, hastily apologized, and was entirely ignored by Gaines as if it were a trivial oversight. Moments later, a black woman entered under similar circumstances, only to be scolded harshly by the judge, who even threatened her with fines if it happened again. Jordan clenched his jaw, feeling a wave of anger swell within him. He managed to remain composed, but his eyes never left Judge Gaines, tracking every word and every reaction. At last, Jordan's name was called. Rising from his seat, he approached the podium with the calm confidence that had become his trademark. His dark blue suit and steady voice stood in stark contrast to the rigidity of the courtroom's atmosphere. Jordan carefully presented his case about his family's property, laying out clear evidence of the taxation error. He opened his folder, pointing to relevant documents, including past tax records and photographs of the land. "Your Honor, as you can see," Jordan began, his voice low but firm, "this new tax assessment is entirely inconsistent with the property's actual value. This is not just a financial issue, it is about preserving my family's legacy, a piece of land that holds deep historical significance for us." Judge Gaines, instead of carefully reviewing the documents, leaned back in his chair with an expression of indifference. He tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, a small gesture that seemed intended to assert his authority. "Mr. Matthews," he said, deliberately emphasizing Jordan's last name as if to remind him of his place. "I will review your documents, but first let me remind you that arriving late is not an acceptable way to show respect for this court." Jordan could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom turning toward him. Keeping his voice calm, he replied, "Your Honor, I've already apologized for being late. This morning I had to attend to an urgent matter involving a human trafficking case. I did not mean any disrespect." Gaines interrupted him, his tone icy. "Whatever your reasons, no matter how important, they do not justify violating the rules of this court. You will be fined $1,000 for contempt." It felt as though an invisible hammer had struck Jordan in the chest. He hadn't expected such a steep fine, especially after watching others who arrived late go completely unpunished. But what enraged him even more was Gaines's attitude, a combination of unchecked authority and blatant bias. "Your Honor," Jordan said, struggling to maintain his composure, "I only ask that the court's rules be applied fairly to everyone." The courtroom fell silent. A palpable tension filled the air as everyone realized that Jordan had just openly questioned the fairness of Judge Gaines. The judge's face turned red and his eyes flashed with anger. "Mr. Matthews," he said, his voice low and menacing, "are you suggesting that I am not fair? This is my courtroom, and I will not allow anyone to question its integrity." Jordan met Gaines' glare without flinching. "Your Honor, I am simply asking for assurance that everyone is treated equally under the law." Jordan's boldness left the courtroom in stunned silence. A few people in the gallery, mostly people of color, looked at him with admiration and hope. However, the uneasy glances from court staff revealed that they sensed the danger in what had just transpired. "This hearing is adjourned," Gaines declared, his voice seething with frustration. He stood, slammed his gavel down, and stormed out of the courtroom, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with mixed emotions. Jordan returned to his seat, but his mind was racing. He knew this wasn't just about personal injustice. It was a systemic problem, deeply embedded in the very fabric of this courthouse. Jordan resolved then and there that he would not stay silent. What he had witnessed was only the beginning of a larger fight. As Jordan left the courthouse, a sense of determination burning within him, an elderly black woman approached him. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We need someone like you to speak up. For too long, these things have happened, and no one has dared to stand up." Jordan offered her a gentle smile, but inside he was filled with unwavering resolve. He glanced back at the old courthouse, its weathered walls seemingly holding countless untold stories of injustice. He knew the battle ahead would be far from easy, but he was ready to face it, for his family, his community, and the principles of justice he had always believed in. Jordan Matthews walked away from the courtroom with a whirlwind of emotions. The sunlight outside did little to dispel the storm of frustration and indignation brewing within him. Judge Gaines' unjust ruling wasn't just a personal slight. It was a glaring reminder of a broken judicial system that had been allowed to persist for far too long. Jordan understood that if he simply paid the fine and walked away, he would be betraying the values his grandmother had instilled in him. Never to turn a blind eye to injustice, no matter how formidable it seemed. This time he resolved his fight would extend far beyond the courtroom walls. Back at his temporary office in his hometown, Jordan began meticulously reviewing his case, carefully noting every detail from the courtroom. The name of Judge Gaines, his biased reprimands, and the stark differences in how he treated different defendants were all recorded in Jordan's notebook. But he knew that simply documenting these observations wasn't enough. To expose a system steeped in injustice, he needed evidence. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence. Jordan decided to dig into Judge Gaines's prior rulings. At first, this seemed like an impossible task, as local court records were often poorly organized and lacked transparency. However, a glimmer of hope surfaced, as he recalled the uneasy but supportive glances exchanged among court staff during the hearing. One person in particular stood out: Misa Thompson, the court clerk. Jordan sensed that she might hold the key to uncovering the hidden truths behind Gaines' rulings. That evening, Jordan reached out to Emily Carter, an investigative journalist he had worked with on a high-profile corruption case in the past. Briefly explaining the situation, he asked for her help in gathering information about the cases Gaines had presided over. Emily, known for her fearless exposés on political and judicial misconduct, immediately saw the gravity of the issue. "Jordan, if what you're saying is true, this isn't just a single case. This is a systemic problem," she said over the phone. "I'll start digging right away." The next morning, Jordan decided to speak directly with Misa Thompson. In the dimly lit hallway of the courthouse, she looked visibly nervous as Jordan approached her. After a few minutes of small talk, she sighed deeply and pulled him into a discreet corner. "I've worked here for over 2 decades, she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've seen so many things that I knew were wrong, but I always felt like there was nothing I could do to change it." Jordan met her eyes with a steady gaze, his seriousness cutting through her hesitation. "You can help me change that," he said, his tone calm but persuasive. After a moment of silence, Misa nodded and led Jordan into her office. From the bottom drawer of her desk, she pulled out an old, worn notebook. "I've written everything down," she whispered. "Dates, names, unfair rulings. I don't know if it'll be of any use, but this is all I have." As Jordan flipped through the pages, he could feel the weight of the injustices documented within. The notebook wasn't just a collection of grievances, it was a living record of a broken system. He thanked Misa and assured her that he would protect her from any potential fallout for coming forward. As Jordan and Emily's investigation progressed, stories from former defendants began to pour in. Some recounted being fined exorbitant amounts for minor infractions, while others described being publicly humiliated and belittled by Judge Gaines in the courtroom. The more evidence Jordan gathered, the clearer it became that Gaines's biased rulings weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger scheme tied to local interest groups. However, Jordan's efforts didn't go unnoticed. One evening, as he drove home after a long day of work, A black SUV appeared in his rearview mirror, following him too closely on an otherwise empty road. Jordan immediately sensed something was wrong and kept his composure, but when the SUV accelerated and attempted to force his car off the road, he realized he was in real danger. With a sharp, calculated maneuver, Jordan managed to evade the vehicle and escape unharmed. But he knew this wasn't a random accident. He had stumbled upon something much bigger, and whoever was behind it didn't want him to continue. This incident only strengthened Jordan's resolve. He understood the risks but was determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The battle he had taken on was no longer just about justice for his family's land. It was about dismantling a system that had perpetuated injustice for far too long. As Jordan faced mounting pressure from all sides, he also found unexpected allies. James Wilson, a longtime courthouse security officer, reached out to Jordan and provided critical information about how Judge Gaines handled his cases. "I've seen what he's been doing for the past 15 years, James said. I can't stay silent anymore." However, not everyone was on Jordan's side. A former colleague, someone Jordan once trusted, turned out to be working with one of the interest groups tied to Gaines. This individual attempted to steal documents from Jordan's office, forcing him to be even more vigilant and cautious about who he allowed into his inner circle. The investigation reached its peak when Emily Carter published an explosive article exposing the details of Gaines' misconduct on the front page of a major newspaper. The headline, "Injustice in the Courtroom, Judge Gaines and His Biased Rulings," quickly went viral, drawing widespread public attention. Civil rights organizations began organizing protests, demanding an independent investigation and accountability. Meanwhile, Jordan and his team prepared for the ultimate step, a special court hearing to directly challenge Gaines' rulings. The tension reached a boiling point as Judge Gaines tried to deny all accusations, leveraging his authority to intimidate those involved. But this time, Jordan was ready. He knew they were moving in the right direction, and that justice was within reach. As the truth began to illuminate the darkness surrounding the Greenville courthouse, Jordan found himself fighting not just for his family, but for all those who had suffered under this broken system. He understood that the battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a strong sense of hope that justice would prevail. That morning, the Greenville courthouse buzzed with more activity than usual. Crowds gathered in large numbers, not just for the routine cases, but for the highly anticipated special hearing, Jordan Matthews' public confrontation with Judge Edward Gaines. For many, this was the moment when the truth would finally come to light. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation, while inside, the atmosphere was even more charged with tension. Jordan, dressed in his signature deep blue suit, entered the courtroom with a calm demeanor, but his eyes reflected unwavering determination. Weeks of grueling investigation had led to this moment. The evidence he and his team had meticulously gathered would not only expose the biases in Gaines' rulings, but also reveal his murky ties to local interest groups. Step by step, Jordan had prepared for this confrontation with the most powerful judge in Greenville. When Judge Gaines entered the courtroom, everyone stood. He maintained his usual air of authority, but Jordan noticed subtle signs of unease in his gaze. Gaines could sense that today's proceedings would be unlike any other he had presided over. As the hearing began, Gaines' eyes scanned the room, eventually settling on Jordan. "Mr. Matthews," he said, his voice icy, "I hear you have some statements to make today." Jordan rose from his seat and approached the podium, holding carefully organized documents in his hands. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and resonant, "I have evidence showing that your rulings over the years have demonstrated clear patterns of bias and unfair treatment, particularly toward defendants from minority groups." The room fell completely silent. No one dared to move, their eyes fixed on Jordan as he spoke. Gaines raised an eyebrow, trying to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed a hint of discomfort. "What exactly are you implying, Matthews? That I've been unfair in my rulings?" Jordan held his gaze, undeterred by the intimidation in Gaines' tone. He raised a stack of documents and said, "This is data from over 200 cases you've presided over in the past 5 years. Numbers don't lie, Your Honor. Minority defendants, particularly those with lower incomes, were fined an average of 300% more than white defendants for similar offenses." Jordan turned to a large screen displaying a chart. The clear, undeniable data left the courtroom in stunned silence. And not only that, Jordan continued, witness testimony and court records show repeated instances of biased judgments, where white defendants received reduced sentences or were acquitted under suspicious circumstances. Gaines interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Mr. Matthews, I will not allow you to tarnish the reputation of this court. If all you have are baseless accusations, I suggest you stop. Jordan gave a small, knowing smile, not one of amusement, but of quiet confidence. Your Honor, I'm not tarnishing anything. I'm presenting facts. And these facts won't come solely from me. They will be corroborated by witnesses here in this courtroom. Misa Thompson, the longtime court clerk, was the first witness called to the stand. Though visibly nervous, she stood her ground as she began to testify. I've worked with Judge Gaines for over 20 years, she said, her voice shaky but firm. I've kept track of everything I felt was wrong. This is the notebook I've maintained over the years. She handed over her notebook, which Jordan held up for the courtroom to see. He read aloud some of the most striking entries. March 15th, 2022. A minority defendant was fined $1,500 for a parking violation, while a white defendant with the same offense received only a warning on the same day. Jordan continued reading more entries, each one a glaring example of injustice. Gaines began to lose his composure. These are merely personal opinions from Ms. Thompson, he shouted, his voice tinged with both anger and panic. But the courtroom was no longer his domain. The truth was steadily eroding the authority he once wielded. As the tension reached its peak, James Wilson, the veteran courthouse security officer, stood up unexpectedly. He requested permission to speak. Your Honor, James began, his voice calm yet resolute, I've worked under you for 15 years. I've seen what you've done, and I can't stay silent anymore. James recounted instances where he witnessed Gaines accepting envelopes from attorneys representing local interest groups in exchange for favorable rulings. His testimony was a devastating blow to Gaines' defense, stripping away any remaining credibility. By now, Gaines could no longer hide his unease. His hands trembled, and his attempts to deny the allegations were met with overwhelming evidence and the powerful testimony of witnesses. When Jordan finished his presentation, the room fell into an almost oppressive silence. Finally, a representative from the Judicial Review Commission, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward. Judge Gaines, the representative said, his voice firm, based on the evidence presented today, we are launching a full investigation into your conduct. Gaines attempted to maintain a facade of calm, but his pale face betrayed his fear. He stood, declared the hearing adjourned, and left the courtroom in a heavy, ominous silence. As Gaines exited, the courtroom erupted into applause. For those who had endured years of oppression, it felt as though justice was finally being served. Jordan, though relieved, didn't allow himself to celebrate. He knew this was only the beginning of a long battle to reform the justice system in Greenville. As Jordan stepped outside, the crowd erupted in cheers, hailing him as a hero. But Jordan didn't see himself that way. To him, he was simply doing his duty, standing up against the injustices he couldn't ignore. That evening, Jordan returned to his office to find an anonymous letter waiting on his desk. The message was short but chilling. We know what you're doing. You can't change everything. Jordan read the words, sighed, and clenched his fists. He knew the fight was far from over, but he was ready. Months later, the Greenville courthouse was nearly unrecognizable. Gentle sunlight streamed through its newly cleaned windows, illuminating a space that had undergone not just a physical transformation, but a systemic one. The old peeling walls had been repainted, and multilingual signs now welcomed visitors, offering resources for navigating the legal system. At the entrance, a reception desk staffed by helpful clerks provided guidance on legal procedures and support services. But the most profound changes weren't visible on the surface. They were embedded in the very culture of the courthouse. Thanks to Jordan Matthews' bravery, meaningful reforms had begun to take root. and Greenville's justice system was finally moving toward a fairer future. Just weeks after the historic trial where Jordan Matthews exposed the injustices of Judge Gaines, the Judicial Review Commission released a comprehensive report. The report revealed that it wasn't just Gaines. Greenville's entire judicial system had been warped by prejudice and personal interests. The data showed that minority defendants were consistently penalized more harshly, while wealthy individuals, often white, were granted undue leniency. As a result, Judge Gaines was forced to resign and faced criminal investigations for abuse of power and accepting bribes. But for Jordan, this was far from the end. He knew that removing one individual was only the first step. Changing an entire system would be a long journey. What mattered most was ensuring that these reforms weren't just superficial, but truly transformed the way people were treated under the law. The reforms sparked by the report and the community's support brought about positive changes. Greenville's courts began comprehensive training for judges, clerks, and staff on unconscious bias and strategies to eliminate it in their work. Court rulings would now undergo regular reviews by an independent committee to ensure fairness and transparency. More importantly, the court system expanded its free legal assistance programs for underserved communities, ensuring they no longer felt abandoned when facing legal challenges. Jordan felt a deep sense of pride as he witnessed these changes. He knew his efforts weren't just impacting Greenville, but were spreading to other cities across the state and even the nation. Young lawyers, especially those from minority communities, began to look up to him as a symbol of hope. A person who proved that justice could be upheld, even in the face of a flawed system. Jordan was frequently invited to speak at conferences and law schools across the country. At one such event, he shared his reflections. The fight I took on wasn't just about a judge or a single court. It was about a system and how we treat one another as human beings. Justice isn't just about laws on paper or the decisions handed down in courtrooms. It's about how we listen, empathize, and act when we see wrongdoing. He emphasized that real change doesn't come from grand gestures, but from small, determined actions. A clerk who dares to document injustices, a security officer who speaks out, or a journalist who exposes the truth. All these individuals play a crucial role in creating significant change. What I have learned, Jordan continued, is that we can't fight these battles alone. My success came from the support of the community, from those who stood up when they saw me stand up. Remember this, silence is never the solution. Only when we dare to speak and act can we build a fairer society. Jordan's fight not only inspired others, but also offered practical lessons for lawyers and everyday citizens. Organized action, confronting a flawed system, requires plans and concrete data. Jordan didn't rely solely on his frustration. He gathered evidence, built a strategy, and collaborated with experts. The power of community. Change cannot happen through the actions of one person alone. Support from the community, from Misa Thompson to James Wilson, was key to Jordan's victory. The value of perseverance. Despite facing danger and threats, Jordan remained steadfast in his mission. He demonstrated that meaningful change takes time and courage. The importance of education and awareness. The reforms Jordan championed weren't just about laws, they were about changing societal perceptions. He always stressed that every individual, from judges to ordinary citizens, has a role in ensuring fairness. 3 months after Judge Gaines' resignation, Jordan was invited back to the Greenville courthouse to attend the inauguration of a new judicial ethics center established to ensure transparency and accountability within the system. Standing before an audience of judges, lawyers, and local residents, Jordan shared his thoughts. Today, we're not just marking the beginning of a new center. We're marking the start of a future where justice is no longer a privilege for the few, but a right for everyone. Under the attentive gaze of the crowd, he concluded his speech with a powerful message. We cannot change everything in a single day, but if each of us acts in the name of justice, change will spread. A photograph of Jordan standing among a group of passionate young law students was later hung prominently in the new center. Beneath the photo, a plaque bore the inscription, "Justice is everyone's right. Stand up when you see injustice. Jordan didn't see himself as a hero. To him, he was simply someone who refused to turn a blind eye to wrongdoing. But to the people of Greenville and beyond, he became a beacon of hope, guiding those who dared to dream of a fairer, more transparent system. Jordan Matthews' journey left behind not only concrete reforms, but also a profound message. Anyone can make a difference if they dare to stand up, speak out, and take action.